Nobody in that crowd could explain afterward why they stopped. There was no announcement, no commotion, no raised voice cutting through the noise of Portobello Road on a gray September morning. Just a man's hand, reaching across a folding market table, lifting an old acoustic guitar by the neck, turning it slowly in the dull morning light, and a young woman behind the table, head shaved clean, shoulders too still for someone who wasn't holding something together with everything she had. For a moment, no one moved. That was when the whisper started. 3 people back, then 5, then outward, spreading the way cold spreads, quiet, inevitable, impossible to stop once it begins. The man holding the guitar didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the instrument, then on the girl, then on a small handwritten card taped to the inside of the open case. He read it without speaking. The girl watched his face, and something crossed her expression then. Not recognition, not surprise, something older than both. The look of a person standing at the exact edge of the thing they've been dreading, finally feeling the ground give way beneath them. The crowd pressed closer, silent in the way crowds only go silent when they understand, without being told, that they are witnessing something that does not belong to them. She had carried that guitar to Portobello Road that Tuesday morning with one intention, one number on a handwritten card, one decision she had spent 14 months refusing to make. She told herself it was practical. She told herself her father would have understood. She had almost convinced herself of both things. And then a stranger's hand lifted the guild off the table, and every word of that story she'd been telling herself simply stopped. What happened in the next 4 minutes would change the rest of her life. But to understand why, you have to go back to a promise made at the edge of everything. If you've never heard this story, subscribe, because some stories are too important to miss. Daniel Marsh was not the kind of man who took up space in a room. He was a carpenter from Manchester who wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, made his tea too strong, and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. He was not famous. He never tried to be. But on Sunday mornings, when the light came through the kitchen window at a low angle and the house was still quiet, he would pull a battered acoustic guitar from its case, settle into the chair by the window, and play. Not for anyone, not for applause, just because it was the one place in his life where everything that needed saying got said without words. The guitar was a 1962 Guild F50 acoustic. He had bought it in 1983 from a closing music shop on Deansgate for £40 cash. The wood was already aged when he bought it, the neck repaired once, the finish worn thin along the body where decades of arms had rested across it. The shop owner told him it had belonged to a session musician who played on recordings nobody remembered. Daniel didn't care about the history. He cared about the sound. Warm, full, slightly imperfect. The kind of sound that felt like it had earned something. His daughter, Clara, was born in 1997. By the time she was 7, she knew every chord he had taught her. By 12, she was writing her own songs on the same guild, sitting in the same chair, in the same morning light. Daniel used to say she played it better than he ever did. Then he would act wounded about it. Then he would laugh. It was their language, the one they used for everything the two of them were too much alike to say directly. The guitar was how they stayed close without having to explain why closeness mattered. In 2016, Daniel was diagnosed with lung cancer, stage 3. He fought it for 22 months the way quiet men fight things, without performance, without complaint, with a stubbornness that looked from the outside like peace. In January 2018, he lost. The night before he died, he pressed the guild into Clara's hands. His voice was almost gone. His eyes were not. "This carries everything I never got to say," he told her. "Don't ever sell it. As long as you have it, I'm still in the room with you." She pressed her forehead to his. She promised. 8 months later, the hospital called with her results. and the promise she had made in that room began its slow collision with survival. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Not her mother. Not the nurse who called every Tuesday to check in. Not the friend who had offered 3 times to help with the bills and been turned down 3 times with the same quiet, firm no. Clara packed the Guild into its case at 6:30 in the morning, borrowed a folding table from the neighbor downstairs, and took the first train from Manchester to London, with the guitar on the seat beside her, like a passenger she wasn't ready to look at directly. She set up on Portobello Road just before 8. The market was already breathing, stall holders arranging displays, early browsers moving slow, the smell of coffee and cold stone hanging in the September air. She taped the handwritten card to the inside of the open case and sat down behind the table on a low stool she'd carried in a bag over her shoulder. The card said one thing: original acoustic guitar, 1962, Guild F50, selling to cover cancer treatment. 180 pounds, firm. She didn't write a story on it. She didn't want pity. She wanted 180 pounds and for it to be finished. The first hour passed without a single person stopping. The second hour brought browsers, a teenager who asked if it was electric, a couple who leaned in, read the card, and moved on with the particular discomfort of people who feel something and don't know what to do with it. A woman in a yellow coat stopped, read the card, pressed her hand briefly to her chest, and said, "Oh, how awful," before walking away. Robert Hale arrived at 10:30. Mid-50s, leather jacket, the unhurried confidence of a man who made his living knowing when someone needed money more than they needed whatever they were holding. He didn't ask before he opened the case. He lifted the Guild out, ran his thumb down the neck, checked the tuning pegs, held the body up toward the flat gray sky, and examined the grain without speaking. Then he set it back down with the careful indifference of a man delivering a verdict. "Neck has a slight warp," he said. "Not critical, but it brings the value down." He closed the case. "I'll give you 60. Clara said no. The card said 180 pounds. He shrugged. "Nobody at this market pays for sentiment, love. They pay for condition." He glanced once at her shaved head. "I'd take the 60. He walked away. Clara stared at the empty air where he'd been standing. 2 more hours passed. The dizziness that came and went had been coming more than going since noon. She hadn't eaten. The tea was long cold, and for the first time since she'd set up the table that morning, she let herself think the word she'd been refusing all day: mistake. She reached for the case latch. She was done. She was going home. And that was the exact moment she heard footsteps behind her that didn't sound like the market at all. If this story is already getting to you, subscribe. The next part will stop you completely. Paul McCartney was not supposed to be on Portobello Road that morning. He had an early meeting 2 streets over with an antique furniture dealer, a writing bureau he had seen months earlier and finally decided to collect. The meeting finished in under 20 minutes. His security team was already moving back toward the car. The market was loud, the sky was flat and gray, and Paul McCartney had walked through enough London crowds in his life to move through one without slowing, without being pulled sideways, without stopping. He was 10 yards past Clara's table when something caught him. He couldn't name it in the moment. It wasn't a sound. It was a shape. The silhouette of the open guitar case on the folding table. The specific curve of the body. The proportions of the headstock against the pale morning background. Something that reached back past 60 years and landed in a place he hadn't expected to find, on a Tuesday in a street market. He stopped walking. His security detail noticed and adjusted without a word. Paul turned around. He crossed back to the table slowly. He didn't announce himself. He didn't make eye contact with the growing edge of people who were beginning to recognize him. He looked at the guitar. He lifted it from the case the way a person lifts something they already know the weight of. One hand at the neck, one at the body, a motion so familiar it required no thought. He turned it once in the light, ran his thumb across the strings without pressing them down, just feeling the tension, the response, the particular resonance of old wood that had been played for decades. Then he looked at the card inside the case. He read it without expression. Then he looked at Clara. "When did you last play it?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Only she heard it. Clara blinked. Of everything she had imagined someone might say to her that morning, it was not that. "I can't," she said. "Not anymore." He looked at her steadily. "Why not?" "My hands shake now," she said. "From the treatment." He nodded slowly. The way a person nods when an answer confirms something they already understood before the question was finished. He looked back at the guitar, and something moved across his face then. Not pity, not performance, something older and more private than either. Paul McCartney's mother, Mary, had died of cancer in October 1956. He was 14 years old. In the weeks after she was gone, music was the only place large enough to hold what he was carrying. He had poured everything he couldn't say into songs. He had built an entire life on the foundation of that loss. And standing at a folding table on Portobello Road, holding a worn Guild acoustic that belonged to a dead man he had never met, he recognized something in Clara's face that he had seen only once before, in a mirror, more than 60 years ago. He set the guitar down gently. "What was your father's name?" he asked. Clara's throat tightened. "My mother's name was Mary," he said quietly. "Not performing, not filling silence, just offering it, the way you offer the only thing you actually have. She died when I wasn't much older than you, and for a long time after, music was the only place I could still hear her." He looked at the Guild. "Your father left you this because he wanted to stay in the room with you. You understand that?" It wasn't a question. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything her voice had stopped being able to hold. Paul straightened. He looked at the card one more time. Then he said something quietly to the man beside him. The man nodded, stepped slightly to the side, and made a call. Then a second one. The crowd behind them had grown 20 deep, pressing close and staying silent, with the instinct of people who understood they were standing at the edge of something they would remember. Robert Hale stood at the back of that crowd. He had come back, drawn by the gathering, recognizing the back of a head he should have recognized earlier. He watched. He did not move closer, and Clara sat behind her table, hands folded in her lap to hide the shaking, looking at a man who had just said the only words in the English language that could have reached her that morning, and felt the ground beneath 14 months of grief finally, quietly, begin to shift. If something just shifted in you too, subscribe, because what those 2 phone calls set in motion will stay with you. The crowd saw 2 minutes, maybe 3. A man standing at a market stall, holding a guitar, speaking quietly to a young woman. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, no gesture large enough to photograph cleanly from 20 feet away. And then Paul McCartney handing the guitar back to Clara, not purchasing it, returning it, before straightening, exchanging a brief word with his assistant, and moving away through the crowd that parted for him the way crowds always did, like water finding its level. What only Clara heard was different. Before he straightened, he leaned in slightly, lowered his voice so that what he said existed only between the two of them, sealed off from the crowd and the noise and the gray morning pressing down on all of it. "Don't sell it," he said. "I mean that the practical way, and I mean it the other way too, both." Then he was gone, and the market exhaled. People who had been strangers 20 minutes earlier stood near Clara's table as though they had earned some quiet right to be there. An older man in a wool coat placed 40 pounds on the table without stopping, without waiting for acknowledgement, without looking back. A woman asked if she was all right. Clara nodded, because it was the only response her body had available. Robert Hale was no longer visible at the edge of the crowd. He had gone the way people go when a moment has made them suddenly aware of the smallness of their earlier position. Clara sat behind the empty table for a long time after. The guild was back in its case. The card was still taped to the inside lid. The 40 pounds sat on the table in front of her, and she hadn't touched it. She was thinking about what it meant that a man who had lost his mother to the same disease, who had turned that loss into something that outlasted every chart and every decade and every room it had ever played in, had looked at her and said, "Don't." Not as advice, as recognition, the kind that only moves between people who are carrying the same weight in different decades. She packed the table. She carried the guild back to the station the same way she had carried it there, on the seat beside her, like a passenger. But something in the quality of the silence between them had changed. 48 hours later, her phone rang. A medical coordinator she had never spoken to, a foundation she had never contacted, a quiet, matter-of-fact voice telling her that her full course of treatment had been arranged. All of it, covered completely. Clara sat down on the kitchen floor, not because she decided to, because her legs simply stopped. Her mother walked in and found her there, back against the cabinet, phone in her lap, making a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite breathing and was somehow both. If your chest is tight right now, subscribe. The last thing Clara found that night changes everything. That night, Clara did the thing she always did when the world became too large to hold standing up. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened the guitar case, not to play, not to check on it, just to be near it, the way you are near the people who make silence feel safe. She lifted the guild out slowly, set it across her lap, and was about to close the case when she saw it. Tucked beneath the lever strap on the inside lid, a folded square of paper, cream-colored, small enough that it would have been invisible if she hadn't been looking directly at it. She unfolded it with both hands. 3 lines, written by hand, in a script she didn't recognize, in ink that pressed firmly into the page, the way writing does when the person holding the pen means every word without reservation. Your father knew what he was doing. So do you. Keep playing. No signature. She had held herself together through the diagnosis, through the first round of treatment, through the morning she stood in the bathroom and watched her hair come away in her hands and told herself it didn't matter when it did. Through 14 months of medical bills and parental whispers and the particular loneliness of being young and sick in a world still moving at full speed around you. Through the decision to take the guild to Portobello Road, through the market and Robert Hale and the crowd and the 2 phone calls and her mother on the kitchen floor beside her. She broke open over 3 lines on a piece of paper, not loudly, just the slow, total release of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long and has finally, in the space of 3 sentences, been given permission to put it down. Her mother appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak. She didn't cross the room. She simply stood there, and that was exactly right. The note is framed now. It hangs on the wall of the flat Clara moved into when treatment ended, above the chair by the window, above the guild on its stand. Not a shrine, not a display, just there, the way things that matter are simply there, without needing to announce themselves. She plays on Sunday mornings, same time her father always played. Same low morning light coming through the window at an angle that makes the wood of the guild look almost gold. She starts with the first chord he ever taught her, G major. Nothing complicated, everything open, and then she goes wherever the morning wants to take her. Some Sundays she writes, some Sundays she just plays the same 3 chords, until the feeling in her chest settles into something she recognizes as peace. What Paul McCartney knew that Clara only understood months later was that he hadn't stopped at that table because of the guitar. He had stopped because of the way she touched the case before she opened it, with both hands, the way you handle something you're not certain you have the right to release. He recognized that. He had lived inside that exact feeling for 60 years, and he knew, with the certainty of someone who had turned that kind of grief into something that outlasted everything, where it went if nobody interrupted it. So he interrupted it, and a girl who came to Portobello Road to let her father go left with him still in the room. If a stranger's kindness or a father's love has ever found you at exactly the right moment, subscribe. These are the stories that remind us what we're actually made of.